All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for today's webinar. This is the first of a series of 2 webinars on farm transfer and land access in New York and New England. My name is Tim Bello. I'm the New York Programs Manager and Hudson Valley FarmLink Network Coordinator for American Farmland Trust New York office. And I'll be helping to facilitate some of today's calls. So to get started, a couple of basic housekeeping items. The first, if for some reason something happens to your connection, you can log back out, call back in, and use your login number to get back on the call. If you have any issues while you're on the webinar, you should see a menu on the right-hand side of your screen, the upper right-hand side, and one of the choices you have on that menu is labeled chat. If you click on the little plus sign there near the chat, you'll see a little form open up. You can submit any issues you're having to us, and we'll be able to try to help you with those technical difficulties while the webinar is in progress. You'll also see on that menu a little section called questions. As we're going through the webinar today, you can feel free to check on that questions and type in any questions that you have. At the end of the webinar, we'll have some time to go through some of those questions. And for those questions that we get to, we'll respond to them following the webinar, and we'll share them with all the participants via email as well as on our website. And we're also going to have some interactive time at the end of the webinar to address questions via the raise hands feature. So on that menu that you have in the upper right-hand corner, you should see a little selection of icons with a little hand that you can click on to either raise your hand or lower your hand. At the end of the webinar, when we're taking questions, you can click on that, and I'll try to get through to as many of the questions as possible. With that said, I'd like to do a couple of introductions. So today's presenters are Chris Coffin, who was a New England director for American Farmland Trust, is now consulting for AFT while transitioning to a new role as the policy director for Land for Good. Jen Dempsey is also with us today. She's the director of the Farmland Information Center with American Farmland Trust. And Gary Keogh, a state statistician in New England with the National Agricultural Statistics Service. I also want to take a moment to recognize Kathy Roof is on the line. She's the Senior Program Director with Land for Good. And this project that we're going to talk about today was done in collaboration with Land for Good. So we're glad to have Kathy with us this morning. She'll also be presenting for tomorrow's webinar. I also wanted to take a moment to just mention there was a 10-person advisory committee involved in helping to get this project organized. So a big thanks to that committee, and they were integral in a lot of the decision-making and how the project unfolded. So briefly, the goal of the Gaining Insights, Gaining Access, Securing Farmland for the Next Generation of Farmers project is to help next generation farmers in New York and New England gain access to affordable land. And the project builds towards this goal through research, capacity building, and communications. The research aims to inform the ways that public policy and the work of land trusts and agricultural service providers can motivate landowners to connect with next generation farmers. The capacity building is aimed at growing and strengthening the region's network of professionals that help to facilitate farm transfers and expand farmland access for next-gen farmers. And the communications and media engagement are intended to generate interest among landowners in working with next-generation farmers and encouraging political support for public policies that motivate additional landowners to do so. So we're about to get started, and I'm going to turn over the e-mic to Chris Coffin. Just briefly before doing so, I want to mention that tomorrow we also have a webinar. It's at the same time from noon to 1. And we're going to be talking about what we learned from a series of focus groups with senior farmers without identified successors. So we're going to be discussing some of the information we learned from that group of farmers, how we could better assist older and retiring farmers in planning for succession, and how that planning may differ between farmers with and without successors. So stay tuned for that webinar tomorrow, and I hope you can join us for that as well. And with all that said, Chris, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim, and welcome everybody. And if for any reason you can't hear us, please again use that little chat sign to indicate a problem. So Tim walked through a little bit about the objectives, and I just want to talk again, just sort of overview in the products that are coming out of this project that was, as Tim mentioned, done in collaboration with Land for Good and with the help of a 10-member advisory team. We did a special tabulation of 2012 Census of Agriculture data, and that was something that we asked the National Agricultural Statistics Service to run data a certain way, and they provided it back to us. We also did some senior farmer focus groups that we are not going to talk about today, but we'll talk about tomorrow. we are taking the findings from those two products and putting them into 7 distinct state profiles. And we hope that these will be useful to all the people on the call and many others to help both making the case for needing to focus on some of these issues, as well as sort of helping people to think about how they might focus on this issue and how programming and policies might be fashioned to address some of the issues around farm transfer and succession and land access. So just in terms of the research context, to sort of take it from the big perspective and what we know and what we tried to gain from this. Again, half of U.S. farmland, or up to half, is estimated to change hands, and up to 25% of farmers are likely to retire during the next 2 decades. That's piecing together information from various sources that come from USDA. So there is no national data on farmers without successors. We can't say anywhere in the country that farmers have or have not successors. And as I'm saying this, I'm looking at Jennifer Dempsey, who is with our Farmland Information Center, to make sure she's nodding when I say this. So we have needed to use proxies in terms of our research to see what we can say and what we can learn about how many farmers may or may not have successors. We do know from research that's been done in Iowa that only 1/3 of retiring Iowa farmers had an identified successor. And we also know that the pattern of succession in farming is changing because less farmers are coming from farm families, and it's changing the dynamics around succession. So in that context, we set about this project to figure out what we know, both what we could learn both from the census and then to actually delve in and to have conversations with farmers who self-identified as not having successors. The overview now of what we're going to talk about today is we wanted to start with just a few trend lines from the last 3 censuses of agriculture, both around farmland and around farmer demographics. We then want to talk specifically about some of the findings from our special tabulation of the 2012 census data. And in that, you can see that we focus on 3 different demographics. Seniors, so those are age 65 plus. Beginners, and the definition of beginning farmers in the 2012 census of agriculture was less than 10 years on the current farm, which is different than the definition that has been used in the censuses before 2012. And then lastly, the 3rd demographic we are calling young, and that is what we defined as age under 45. That is not a category. They are not called young anywhere in the census. We just chose to use that number somewhat arbitrarily for our definition of young farmers. Then we're going to turn to a little bit about the new total survey that is more recent survey that's come out of USDA that focuses both on farmers and non-farming landowners, and what that tells us. And then lastly, we're just going to summarize sort of what we think some of the takeaways are and what some of the questions that have come up in our minds as we've done this project. So let's start by looking at a few of the land use and farmer demographic trends. These are from the 2002, 2007, and 2012 Census of Agriculture. So, and we've split these. I'm sorry we couldn't go through all 7 states individually. So we have aggregated to New England, and so we have charts for many of these that are New England total and New York. So looking at the trend of land in farms in New England, again, the census is a blunt instrument, doesn't tell us very much about how much has been lost. We don't know where the farmland has gone when it's changed, but we just know sort of that there is, for instance, in this case, significantly less land in cropland. Do we know how much of that has been developed? No. We know, looking at the trends, you can see that probably some of it has reverted back to forest, and perhaps some has gone back into pasture, but we don't know. We do know that there's an overall increase in the total number of acres of land and farms. And let me just say, as we're going forward, as people have questions, think about it, and if there are particular questions, we're delighted to have Gary Keogh with us, who is the ag census guru in New England, who can help us walk through questions that people might have. Looking at the New York trend, again, it's a similar trend and a drop in cropland acres, and a little bit of an increase in that other category. And remember, as we're walking through this, that these are land in farms. A farm is defined as any operation that is generated $1,000 in market value in a single year, or would have been able to. Again, that's a distinction that Gary can talk about if people have questions about that. Moving on to principal farm operators, again, we sort of just wanted to give the overview of what the population looks like. So this is New England, and as you can see, there's both now this is just principal farm operators. In principals, there is one principal farm operator per farm. And this is either, it doesn't necessarily need to be the person filling out the census form. It is the person who is the primary person making the day-to-day decisions. So it could be a hired farm manager who is the principal operator, or it could be an owner-operator. But you can see that there is a significant growth in farmers, principal farm operators who are age 55 and older. That is true in New York as well. And again, you see in both New York and New England a decline in the number of young, at least in the 35 to 44 ages and in that 45 to 54 category, but with a little uptick, which is great to see in the category of principal operators under the age of 35. So then we were interested just in sort of, okay, let's take a deeper look in the young farmers, and we see that that trend is true, but was it true when you add in all of the young farmers? So not just the principal farmers, but the secondary and tertiary farm operators. The census actually does have fourth and fifth operators, which you see on some of the bigger, particularly multifamily farms. Those fourth and fifth operators don't show up. Those ages are not tracked, so it's not possible to know those ages. But in terms of the three types of farm operators that census asks for ages, there is a drop both in New England and in New York in terms of those young operators. Again, it does not include farm labor, so there might be plenty of young folks who are working on farms, but they might not be in any kind of a management role, so they wouldn't necessarily show up as a farm or be identified through the census as a farm operator. So now we're going to turn to some of the insights that we got from our special tabulation. Beginning with, again, let's start by looking at what the principal farm operators by age were in 2012, which we've already seen a little bit of. So what we're focusing in this sort of section of it is the orange and the blue. So the orange are the age 65, which again are about a little less than a third in each of the geographic areas, and the under 45s. And to me, it's interesting that New York and New England have very similar age demographics in this case. We then wanted to look and see, okay, how much in terms of the land use footprint of particularly these senior farmers and the young farmers, are they more or less the same? And in New York, those percentages, if you go back, you know, they are very close to being the same. In New York, actually, in New England, that 30% of senior farmers actually manage a little bit more, manage 33% of the land and farms in the region. So then we went on to ask how many senior farmers, senior farm operators have a young farm operator working with them. And again, we appreciate that this is a blunt instrument, and so it's as important in terms of what this tells us and what it doesn't tell us. So we obviously don't know what it's clear that there is a very significant number of senior farm operators that don't have anybody age under 45 farming with them. Does it mean that they don't have a successor? We don't know that it doesn't mean that. So as Farm Credit East has pointed out to us, which is very important to keep in mind, that probably many of these farms are not of a size or scale where they could support a second or third operator. So we don't know that there's not a successor. There might be a non-farming family member or a farming family member who's farming another operation who could be poised to take over this land or this business. It also, we don't know whether there are second and third operators on any of these farms where the operators are between the age of 45 and 64. That was, frankly, an oversight when we put in the data request to NAS, that we didn't think to ask that question. We have since gone back to ask it and hope to have that data soon. But it could well be that you could have an 80-year-old principal farm operator and a 50-year-old son or daughter, and that wouldn't show up in, that demographic wouldn't show up in this number. So what it could mean that there isn't anybody to take over this operation when this senior farmer chooses to exit farming. And as a member of our advisory team has pointed out, for somebody age 65, that could still be another 15, 20 years. We need to keep all of those factors in mind, but to us it does underscore that it is a large volume of seniors without somebody young farming with them. So we wanted to take a little bit more, because then in terms of thinking about, okay, if this is a demographic that we collectively, if those organizations looking to keep land in farming and keep farmers on the land, what does this mean? What are the implications in terms of where we focus our efforts? And so we looked then in terms of the land use footprints, and sort of what are the size, both the land use and the economics, what are the demographics here. So when you look at it again, this subcategory of seniors without a second or third operator manage 1.7 million acres of land and farms. That's significant. When you look at, when you go down to ownership and you look at owned, rented, and rented, this rented land, this 316,000 acres, is land that they rent from others. That could be others, that could be non-farming landowners that they're renting land from, or it could be other farmers. And again, they rent out a small amount of land, 118,000 acres, that they are renting to other farmers. So when you look at it again, you know, you can see of the over 9,000 farms in this category, a majority of them are less than 99 acres. So they are on the small side. And that when you look down at the bottom, that there are 217 farms that are these seniors without young farm operators that are managing over 1,000 acres of land. When you look at New England, again, it's interesting that it is very similar, a slightly smaller amount of land and farms, 1.1 million acres that this subcategory manages, and in fact, they are renting out they are renting a fairly small amount of land from others, 137,000 acres. And again, if you look at the kind of pyramid, the majority of these farmers, in fact, like more than in New York, are renting, managing less than 99 acres. That holds true in terms of the sort of typical farm sizes, smaller in New England than New York. But again, you do have a small number, but not insignificant number, that are managing farms from 220 acres up. Looking then at the economic footprint, there are a few things that are interesting from our perspective. One, when you think about it, when you look at the value of land in buildings, that's almost $4.3 billion in assets that this subset of seniors own. And when you think about it, it's $4.3 billion in assets that's going to transfer somehow, some way in the next 20 years or sooner. And thinking from that perspective, what are the tools that are going to be needed to help to encourage that transfer of assets in a way that works for both the exiting farmers and for entering farmers in New York and in New England. Looking then also in terms of the market value. So this market value means basically the value of product that these farms are producing. And so you can tell in terms of the market value by economic class. So you see that there are, again, about a third of these senior farm operators without the young operators with them who are producing their very small farms. They might be retired, they might be very part-time, they're producing less than $2,500 worth of farm product. They might be hobbyists, might always have been it. So importantly, sort of thinking about, okay, how many of them are large-scale farms? And when you sort of, depending on your definition of large scale, but this top one is the more than $250,000 in annual market value, and there are 570 of those farms in New York. It's interesting when you look at, when you compare, and I hope that some of you have been looking at the differences between those farmers that are farming with young operators, and it's it's pretty significant, the difference both in the amount of land that they manage and their average net farm income, and a little bit on the economic classes, and it's a little bit of a chicken and egg. Is it because they were a larger farm they could bring on multiple farm operators, particularly young farm operators, or because they wanted a young farm operator, did they go and expand and were able to expand the farm business to be able to bring on the young farm operator? But as a general rule, they are a larger and generating more income with those younger farm operators. So similarly with New England, you see that the value of land and buildings is $5.6 billion. Again, a significant amount of assets that are likely to change hands. And the similar, and in fact it's even sort of more so, that there are quite a number of these seniors that are at the very bottom rung in terms of how much economic output they are producing. But there are, in fact, when you take those top two classes, they're about 1,000, so a little more than 10% that are generating more than 50,000 annually in market value. So then we switched, and we want to talk a little bit about beginning farm operators, because this is the other thing that we asked for detailed information through the special tabulation. We really wanted to know more about the age of beginning farm operators. And this was one of our more striking findings, that in both New York and in New England, the average age of beginning farm operators is over 45, or 45 and over. And you can see New England on the left is that it's over 60%, in fact. So we looked then at these older beginners to understand more. Like we wanted to look a little bit at the economic and land use footprints of beginners sort of by age. And in New York, you can see that younger beginners farm more acreage. That's quite a bit of difference. The 130 acres is the average for under 45s and the 98 for the over 45s. And that the economic footprint, younger beginning farmers are producing an average market value significantly more than their older counterparts. And in terms of average net farm income, that's a somewhat significant difference of between the age groups of beginning farmers. In New England, it's a little bit of a different, it's a smaller difference in the under 45 and the 45 and olders in terms of how much acreage. And in fact, some of the New England states, it's the older farmers who are farming more land than the younger beginning farmers. But it's pretty striking when you look at average net income for the older beginners in New England, is that it's a negative income, much smaller average market value. And the assumption, the takeaway for us in thinking about this, is that the older beginners are bringing significant assets to farming, and that this sort of shows up particularly on the income numbers. The last thing that we looked at that we wanted to compare is looking at the senior farmers and what commodities they are producing compared to what young farm operators are producing, to see how closely they track. And this was interesting for us. This is New England, and so the orange is the principal operators age 65 plus without young farm operators, and the blue are principal operators who are under age 45. Not surprisingly, you're going to see some bigger orange lines because there are more of those principal operators than there are there are more seniors than there are young principal operators. But it was striking to us in looking at some of these, and this is the use of the North American, the NAICS codes, North American Industry Classification System. So that is when you ask, in the census, it asks you what is your primary commodity. So this is sort of done by farms by primary commodity. That where you see there are some striking differences. So in New England, there are much fewer young farmers in fruit. There are many fewer young farmers coming into nursery greenhouse, and there are, I think not surprising, quite a number who are not coming into hay and maple and beef cattle, and my assumption is that there are many more seniors because those are folks who've gone out of dairying and have stayed in hay and have converted to beef cattle particularly. So that's not necessarily surprising. And the rest is sort of maybe what you would expect is that there are quite a number of young farmers who are going into vegetables, particularly, and poultry and eggs and dairy. But for us, this question has become then: are there sectors where we need to be particularly concerned? And so here is New York. Again, you see what is very heartening to see is the number of young farmers in dairy. But again, you see that same sort of difference, that there are not so many young farmers in fruit or in nursery greenhouse, and some in aquaculture and equine. So I'm guessing that people will have many questions about that, but right now we are going to switch to have Jennifer Dempsey, who is with AFT and heads our Farmland Information Center, who is going to walk us through the total survey.
Thanks, Chris. So the information presented up until this point was really from the Census of Ag, as Chris said, and it was focusing on operators and their operations. Another piece of the puzzle is the land owned by the non-operator landlords. So we thought it'd be interesting to select some findings from Total. So Total was released in August by the National Agricultural Statistics Service. It's formally called the 10-Year Ownership and Transition of Agricultural Land Survey. And it's a complete study of all agricultural landlords, operators and non-operators. As I said, it's conducted by NAS, but in collaboration with the Economic Research Service. It was building off an earlier survey and updating information collected as part of the Agricultural Economics and Land Ownership Survey, which some of you may remember, ALOS. This is back in 1999. For Total, information was collected in 2015 for calendar year 2014. They focused on 25 core states. These are states ranked by ag receipts. So we have data available at the national, we have some regional roll-ups, and then we have state-level data for the 25 core states. Unfortunately, none of the New England states and New York, they were not categorized as core states. So what we'll be looking at are data from the Northeast region. So this is 11 states, includes all 6 New England states, New York, plus we have Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. So together that area, the Northeast region as identified by Total, includes 21.6 million acres of farmland in 2014, which is very close to land and farms for that same 11-state region from the 2012 Census of Ag. And then also, just so you have this in the back of your mind, from the 2012 Census of Ag, the New England states and New York together in 2012 had about 11.4 million acres of land and farms. So that's about a little more than half of that Northeast region. So I'm going to focus actually on the non-operator landlord findings, just because that's the missing piece of information. That's the information we really haven't had since the 1999 ALOS. So Total found that there are about 1.9 million non-operator landlords in the U.S. They own and rent out about 283 million acres, which is 80% of land rented for ag. And it's about 31% of farmland in 2014. Now, of this group of non-operators, we have a smaller subset, which is the 1.4 million. They're called principal landlords. And these are individuals or principals in partnerships. And this is the subset of the non-operator group that we have some detailed demographic information. So age and gender, this is the group that we know it for. So in the Northeast, we actually have 130,000 non-operator landlords. They're renting out about 5.5 million acres, which is 87% of the land rented for ag in the region, about 26% of farmland. Again, the smaller subset of principal landlords, it's about 113,000. This is the group that we have the demographic information, so we know their age and we can say something about their gender. In the Northeast, the principal landlords own and rent out about 4.3 million acres. So in terms of transfer, what's interesting about Total is they actually asked agricultural landowners what they plan to do with their land in the next 5 years. So in the Northeast, all agricultural landowners plan to transfer about 2.5 million acres in the next 5 years, which is 12% of the land used for agriculture in the region. 2/3 of this is owned by operators. And then the non-operator landlords said that they plan to transfer 860,000 acres of land. And this is the land they own and rent out. So that's their plans for the next 5 years. It's 16% of the land rented out by all non-operators for farming, 4% of land used for agriculture. So in addition to that question about your plans for the next 5 years, just as Chris was sort of alluding to, it's good to consider ownership by the senior principal landlord. So the two pie charts here are referring to data from the Northeast. You can see that the pie chart on the left is about the number of landlords by age group. The one on the right is about acres owned by the different age groups. So in the Northeast, you have the 52% of all landlords, like 51,000 of the 113,000 principal landlords are actually 65 and older. And then when you consider the acres they own, that proportion actually jumps up. So that age group, 65 and older, which is in the yellow and orange colors, they actually own 59% of the acres owned by the principal landlords. So it's pretty significant. Turns out to be about 12% of all ag land. And then what's really interesting to think about is if you combine the figure that's owned by the principal landlord 65 and older, which is around 2.5 million acres, if you combine that with the land that's owned by the principal operators 65 and older in the region, that's an additional 5.9 million acres. So together, they control or own about 8.4 million acres, which is getting you somewhere around like 38, 39% of the farmland in 2014. So it's significant. So those are the few nuggets I have from Total. And now I'm going to turn it back to Chris for the implications.
Great, thank you. That was very helpful. So just in thinking about, okay, so how can these findings inform programming and policies? What did they tell us? And I think for us, they raised as many questions and things, more things that we wanted to know, as much as sort of to help us think through what are some of the implications. So in some of the questions, it's sort of clearly this is a large demographic, and we don't know necessarily how concerned to be about this 90% of senior farmers and whether they have successors or not. But it does beg the question of, okay, how do we find that? How do we find and how do we reach these senior farmers who may not have an identified successor? That is certainly something that we can talk about if we have time at the end of this. As importantly, how do we support these transitions to young farmers, and particularly as we see, we know from any number of different studies that young farmers have said that land access is a primary challenge for them. This is true for first-generation farmers as well as for young members of established farm families who are still having to buy out the farm from their parents and grandparents, and so how do we support these transitions, particularly when we see that young demographic that is shrinking and not growing. And then this question, do we need to address this growing disconnect? And it was interesting I just had a conversation over the weekend with a farmer he objected to the term senior. He would rather be called well-seasoned. But he said that actually when he was coming out of college, young farmers at that time were being encouraged to go into fruits and nursery and greenhouse. And so it's very interesting that that does not appear to be the case. And do we need to worry about it, or will the market find another use for that kind of land? I think for us that's an open question. What we did sort of come away from this is that when you look at the increasingly large demographic of 45 to 64-year-olds, is that this is one of the places really to start focusing on transition and succession planning, and what are the ways to really reach that demographic group to begin that conversation so that they are not at a point much later in life where it becomes impossible to achieve their vision for the future. And of this demographic of 45 to 64, what are the unique needs and contributions of the older beginners? As Kathy Roof has pointed out, these older beginners are in many cases trying to both grow a farm enterprise while they're needing to think about succession. So that's a kind of unique challenge for them, but they clearly are also in the position of bringing resources to agriculture that younger beginners are not as able to do. And what is then, that is clearly an opportunity to help in this sort of transfer. What does it mean? And so then lastly, that gets us to our last point, that these policies and services to support beginning farmers need to recognize that this is a demographic that is got a wide diversity of folks who might be very young and coming in with very few resources to those who are coming in at mid-career or end of career with significant resources that they are putting to it. So those are some of the takeaways and thinking. At this point in time, I think we would love to open it up for questions and comments. I will say before we do that, the state profiles that we are in the process of creating, we will have them done at some point in December. If people, from having listened to this, have particular thoughts, much of that information in here will be done at the individual state level in those profiles. If people have particular suggestions on how we might want to phrase things, we would love to have those either as part of this conversation right now or via email. I apologize, I did not put our emails in here. Mine is ccoffin@farmland.org. Kathy Roof is kroof, R-U-H-F, at landforgood. No, I'm sorry, it's Kathy at landforgood.org. Jen Dempsey is J Dempsey, D-E-M-P-S-E-Y, at farmland.org. And Tim is T Bello, B-I-E-L-L-O, at farmland.org. And since we do have Gary Keogh on the phone, if people have particular census questions, we might ask Gary to jump in and answer them. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tim.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone else. Before we launch in to some of the questions, I just want to remind everybody that in that menu box that you have there, there is that raise hand feature, so feel free to make use of that in just a moment. There was one question that was in particular that was brought up regarding the different demographics within that sort of beginning farmer group. And I think near the end you sort of touched on some of it, but just to reiterate it in case there's a little bit more to say there, the question was, have you considered about between those two groups, the younger than 45 or the 45 and older beginning farmers, and those for that older group who are entering agriculture with potentially more money and other assets and skills, as you mentioned, that they're bringing something to the table, and should there be any prioritization between those two groups, either towards those older beginning farmers considering those special skills, or towards those younger farmers considering their age? So how would you think about targeting those two groups, whether it's in terms of priority or just what's different between the two, or what would be similar?
Boy, that's a really good question, and I'm going to ask Kathy if she would like to take a first crack at answering that.
Yeah, am I hearable?
Yep, we can hear you.
Well, yeah, this is probably a conversation that we could have on a whole separate webinar. I think that there are, I mean, I can argue that it's important to pay attention to the younger demographic. They, from the data, you know, they're generating more economic activity. They probably or hopefully have a longer span to scale up and make contributions, and at the same time maybe less resourced. So I think it's important for us to pay special attention to the younger demographic. I think the older one, because of what Chris mentioned, that I sort of tease about these folks needing help with entry and exit at the same time, and do have sort of a different profile in terms of their resources. I think we need to understand more who they are and what their plans are. Their whether they're, you know, their land base may be actually more significant. I forget exactly what the data reflects there. So given that this was sort of a surprise demographic for us, and also keep in mind that when we're talking about the definition of a farm, you know, most of these farms generate small annual sales under $10,000. So we need to think sort of more broadly about who we're targeting from that vantage point as well. So I think it's an important conversation to have, and if there are any folks on this call that have more thoughts about that, weigh in now, or let's find some other times to talk about it. Is there something else about this? Wait a minute. Excluding 45, what are the legal requirements? It's hard for me to read the question, Tim. What is that part about?
I believe it's just a question, is there any way to target policies? I think the question is sort of trying to suss out if there is going to be any different policy recommendation for the different age groups, or is that, and with the question of would that be discriminatory to create policies for the different age groups?
Oh, well, I think that's a good point. I don't know that it would be that blunt. You know, I don't think USDA focuses that way, but American Farm Bureau Federation talks about their young farmer program as being 35 and under, and I'm not sure, Holly, I think you're on the call thinking about National Young Farmer Coalition. So as long as we're not talking about actually, you know, formal public policies, seems to me we could be flexible. You know, the definition for USDA is more years on the farm rather than age, which is what points out this conundrum.
Great, thank you. Chris or Jen or Gary, did anybody else want to comment on that?
No, I don't think. I do think I think Kathy's points are excellent, and I think, and actually this I would say in turn, this is in part a question to Gary, and I think we can unmute you to answer this. It would probably help us to know more on the beginners to get a better sense of their economic footprint. I mean, this gives us, again, I've been sort of going back and forth between New York and New England and the average market value based on it, but you know, my guess is that there probably are a whole lot of older beginners who are very part-time, coming at it just for retirement and part-time. And so again, what is this economic footprint? And again, would policies need to be encouraging, or how might they address older beginners, sort of depending on whether they are really trying to be a commercial enterprise or not? Because I'm guessing there are quite a number that aren't, or just are very happy to stay at a fairly small level. And so it would be good to know. It would be good to know more in terms of what the economic footprint is, and whether I think we actually could do a little bit more sussing that out with the information we have. But that might be a question for Gary Keogh.
All right. Is Gary going to come on now, or should we move to a next question?
I don't know. Gary, can you talk?
Want to unmute?
Yeah, you're good.
Getting a bit of an echo.
I know, that's the problem.
All right, I think we're going to have to mute.
Okay, how about
if we can
really quickly,
about
while
now?
we're waiting to... Oh, Gary, go ahead. Well, very quickly, there were a number of questions asked about making this PowerPoint available. So just so everybody knows, yes, it will be made available, and you'll get it in an email later this week.
Okay. All right. This
Yes,
is
go ahead.
Gary. Okay, Gary, I'm addressing the being able to measure the impact of beginning farmers over 45. Another publication from the Census of Agriculture deals with typology, where we have information about farm operators who say they are retired, and this could be retired from farming or from another occupation. Within that breakdown of the demographic of the typology would include some information about how many years they have been operating on current place. A sense of the number of those retired farms or in lifestyle type farms. Another group that's included sort of help determine how many of the beginning farmers over 45 are serious about.
Gary, I'm very, very sorry to interrupt. For some reason, your connection's coming through really choppy. So what I'm hoping that we could do maybe is, if people have some specific questions for Gary, please submit those in this question feature. We'll get those to Gary, and we'll send back some written responses from him as well as others. And Gary, again, my apology for that. But before we run out of time, there were a couple of other questions that I wanted to get to. Thank you, everybody, for being patient and for getting these questions in there. One of which was a question about was there any difference in off-farm income among the different age groups or other farmer group characteristics that were analyzed in this special tabulation?
That's a very good question. No, for the purpose of this, in terms of what we know about off-farm income. And again, that will be something that we'll go back and check with Gary. I don't remember off the top of my head whether the data that we got back would allow us to look at the amount of off-farm income. It depends on what charts that they ran for us using this filter of without second and third operators. So I'd have to go back and check. But I will certainly find that out.
Great, thank you. Another question that might be quick to answer is there a definition for hobby farm? That came up earlier, and someone was asked a question about that, and they said, I am referring to the net income of $1734. I don't know if that means something to one of the presenters here.
Well, it's too bad that Gary, this is Kathy, it's too bad that Gary can't get on. I'm thinking maybe there's a way that we can incorporate what he was trying to say. The hobby farm is one way of talking about these residential or lifestyle farms, and it's within the USDA typology. So I'm thinking maybe we could put a slide or two about that typology and sort of unpack what those things mean, because I think that's a really important framework for people on this webinar to learn about if they're not already super familiar with it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, we're getting close to the end. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So to that end, there was a question about, has any data been collected regarding farmers who have sold the development rights to their farmland?
So I think, so I'm going to turn this to Jen Dempsey because she can answer.
So there have been a number of surveys of participants in permanent farmland protection programs, but I guess it would be, the question is what kind of data would you be interested in? So our most recent survey of this type, we actually looked at participants in the federal farmland protection program, and my memory is that we did include sort of some demographic information. We had some information about the size of the operation. We had a lot of data about what they did with the proceeds of the sale. So if you can give me, or you can email me directly about the kind of data you're looking for, I can direct you to the best, either that relatively recent, like from 2012, study of participants in the federal program, or I can direct you to one of the state level studies.
Great, thank you. Also a question here. Is there any way to tell for some of these larger, more profitable farms whether or not they have a succession plan in place as compared to on any of the smaller or less profitable farms? Is there any way within the census data to see about the presence or absence of a succession plan?
No.
Okay, that's a quick answer.
Right, yeah.
All right. Well, I just wanted to say then, I guess to the presenters, unless there's anything else that you would like to say, we're getting close to the end. I just wanted to mention that there was a question about the greatest barrier to senior farmers having a farm succession plan. Is it the lack of new farmers, not being able to find new farmers, some other issues? And I think that's a great question that segues to a last mention about tomorrow's webinar. I think some of those things will be discussed during tomorrow's webinar, but I wanted to leave that as the last question for our presenters and to see if you have any last comments.
Kathy, do you want to?
Yeah, I feel like a little rushed. We can talk about that. Chris, we can add a couple of slides. We did some research on that, and there is some other stuff out there. It's not necessarily the lack of an identified successor, although for many of them that is a key barrier. Anyway, I don't know how to answer it quickly. It's not cost. It's not that they don't think it's important. It's procrastination. It's avoidance of a lot of the soft issues around exiting from a meaningful lifestyle. It's definitely financial concerns about if they stop farming, what is their retirement going to look like? Yeah, so there is some. We'll talk a little bit more about it tomorrow. Chris, do you think we could do that?
Yes, I think that is because tomorrow what the plan is on the conversation is to share the insights from the focus groups that we did with senior farmers who self-identified as not having successors. And then to Kathy, Ruth will talk about working with senior farmers without identified successors around succession planning. So that will be something that will be talked about more tomorrow.
Great. Well, thank you very much to all the presenters today. I also want to thank everyone for joining us on today's call. Thank you for your questions. Any of the questions that didn't get answered and the ones also that we did talk about, we'll be answering and sending out a document to everyone who participated, and we'll be sharing that on the website as well. If you have follow-up questions, I would say the easiest thing to do would be send an email to Chris Coffin at ccoffin, C-C-O-F-F-I-N, at farmland.org. And we'll be sure to follow up with you there, and we can direct you to the right person following you sending that question. And don't forget about tomorrow's webinar. We hope you can join us, and we'll be talking about those focus groups and some other senior farmers without identified successor issues that came up through this research. Chris, would you have any last words?
No, just thank you all for attending, and we will again try and answer your questions electronically, and thanks for the insights, and we can